Okay, we are in our second lesson today. For those watching online, our text for this study is basically Esther, the second chapter. We looked at Esther, the first chapter, and tonight we look at Esther, the second chapter. This is where we get introduced to Esther. It's interesting that the story about her that bears her very name as the title of the book would start with an entire chapter where she's not involved at all. And we see the situation. And last week we saw how she was set up for what was going to take place. Now, help me out here. We're being introduced to Esther. Somebody tell me anything that you see here in this chapter about Esther.
She was a knockout.
She was a knockout, that's right. That's right. She was a real beauty.
That she was lovely and beautiful.
That's right. Beauty and lovely.
She had no living parents.
That's right. She was I guess that makes her an orphan, right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the real definition of it. Anything else that you see about Esther? Yes, James?
Well, her actual name is Hadassah.
Hadassah, that's right. That's her Hebrew name.
Yes.
Anything else that we see here? And please overlook the spelling, because I'm sure that spelling is completely...
Well, it looks like she was a Benjamite.
That she was connected to the Benjamite family, yeah, or the tribe.
She kept secret that she was a Jew.
That's right. That's right. She was covert. We'll call it covertly covert Jew.
She was instructed to do that.
That's right. She was instructed to do that because things were getting, as we'll tell later in the story, things were getting rather hairy when it comes to the Jews.
She was raised by her uncle?
That's right. She was raised by her uncle. What was her uncle's name? Mordecai. Anything else that you learned about Esther there?
She was young.
She was young. That's right. That's right. She was young.
She was willing to take counsel.
That's right. That's right. She was
She listened to both Mordecai and she listened to the head eunuch.
She was teachable. Yes, James.
I doesn't say it directly, but I think it's pretty clear through all this that God gave her favor the whole time. And God was watching over her.
That's right. Divine favor. I believe it's obvious, and we'll see. Tonight we'll take a look at that favor, and we'll see why. I personally believe that it is divine favor, and not just a natural charm.
I think it's interesting that in chapter 2 they don't really tell what she thought of this whole deal.
That's right. That's right. It's not. We only see a narrated version of this entire story, unless she says it or she speaks it or anything like that. It doesn't get into thinking behind it. But we can be clear one thing, that the Hebrews believed that if you believe something, that's what you lived. That truth and action was inseparable. That that if you believed the right things, you lived the right way. So to them, being Hebrews writing to this, they feel that her motives was obvious by her action. But exactly, you don't see a lot of insight into how. In American and in the Western world, that's key to stories that we write, is how people think and how people. Anything else that we've learned that we see here about Esther?
It's not really one thing we find. She was, as when the king called, we know God's hand is in this, because When the king, he called for all the young women. The Hebrews had been slaves for so long, they were almost intermingled with the Assyrian. And the king did not set out a decree to just look for the beautiful Assyrian women. It was every woman.
Everybody.
And God's hand had to be in that, because as we know, King Ahasuerus, as egotistical and narcissistic as he was, you would have thought for sure he would just pick a woman of his own nationality to be his next queen, not just anybody that happened to be in the land.
That's right. That's right. So let's say that she, to include that, let's say she was chosen in so many ways. She was chosen by God, by the king, and as scholars point out, this was just not the way the Persians did things. That Persian kings married Persian royalty, right, and Persian aristocrats and things like that. And so for this to even take place was God's intervention in God's hand. What else do we can you see here that we see about Hadassah or Esther?
She had a lot of maidservants.
That's right. When in the process, she was well. Let's put it this way: she was surrounded. And we're going to see how that really plays in the interaction that she had, how that played into what God was doing in her life. Yes, James.
And I guess before she was celebrated, like at the end, he threw a feast in her name, like literally.
That's right. She was honored. Anything else?
Mordecai kept an eye on her.
That's right. That's right. She was loved.
Mm-hmm.
You know, sometimes I don't think we understand the trauma that Mordecai had to go through. When the only member of his family was taken from him. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't able to see her. He wasn't able to visit her. He wasn't able to drop in on her. She was basically a prisoner during this entire process.
It wasn't just a couple of days or a couple of weeks, it was months.
It was years.
Yeah, 7 years.
If you look at the first chapter, when does the first chapter say it takes place? At the 3rd year of his reign.
Oh, yeah, because this is year 7.
Vashti made the mistake, was dethroned, was cast out. And then when you look at this, somebody see what it says when she went up to see him? 7 years. The 10th month of the 7th year. So it could be as much as 4 years of preparation before Xerxes is recorded to having ever laid eyes on her. So it was quite the process. Yes. And all the while, Mordecai was having to send messages to her, having to deal with her in that way, because no man could enter into that part because it was the same thing as the harem was, and that it was closed off from the public. Anything else that strikes you about Esther here? Okay, so we're not going to read through this entire text. Sounds like you've covered it well. But tonight we're going to be looking at from this thought: when destiny knocks. When destiny knocks. Now, for most of us, we are accustomed to very mundane days. You know, it's hard. I don't know about you, but maybe it's my age or something. But it's hard for me to remember what I did Monday. Somebody come up to you and say, "What did you do last month?" I couldn't tell them what we did, because they all blur together, because one day seems like the next day, that seems like the next day. For the most part, our lives are pretty routine, our lives are pretty mundane, but then there are those days when God steps into our life. There are those days when his purpose and his plans coincides with our purpose and our plans, and we find ourselves in a situation where we're faced with the destiny that God has for our life. Now, what is that destiny that you're talking about, Derrick? I'm not talking about some situation that you can't control. I'm talking about God's plan for you and your place in God's plan. And Esther would discover that. Esther would find that out. Not in this chapter, it would be later that she'd find that out, but she'd begin to see how life radically changes for her when she finds herself in the midst of what God wanted her to do, in the midst of where God wanted her to be. And I believe in our life that if we will experience what she experienced, and that is the power of a surrendered life, and we give ourselves to God, truly give ourselves to God, and say, whatever you have in store, whatever you have planned for me, whatever you want in my life, when we do that, then we make ourselves available for God to step in and for God to make us a part of what he's doing. That's a powerful thought, and it's a powerful idea in our life. Esther experienced that. Esther knew what it meant to live a surrendered life. Now, Elizabeth L. Elliot said something wonderful. I love it. I love this quote, and she explains it probably so good. She said, "One does not surrender a life in an instant. That which is lifelong can only be surrendered in a lifetime." Let me tell you, Esther's story starts long before chapter 2. Esther's story is a lifetime of learning to surrender to God. It's a lifetime of learning to surrender to what he has in store and what he has planned in her life. It took a lifetime. It also took a lifestyle. She had to learn to live a surrendered life. She had to learn to live in a way that was open to what God wanted for her life. Open to what God... We never see resistance here from her. There's hesitation, but never any resistance here. She's willing to follow God's plan for her future because she has squarely placed her life into God's hands. So we need to realize that as we look at this. Last week we saw how God has set the stage for her and her life. But this week we see how Esther responds and how Esther steps on the scene and how God sets her up for what she is supposed to be for the rest of her days. So tonight we want to look at a couple of things. First of all, we want to look at the very first thing. When destiny knocks, will it find you at home? When destiny knocks, will it find you at home? What does home represent here for us? Home represents that place where we grow. Home represents that place where we get comfortable with an environment. We get comfortable with a set of situations. Esther's surrender began under the tutelage and the house of Mordecai. Mordecai showed her how to surrender to God. Mordecai taught her how to live a surrendered life. And she learned that and found that at home in her life. Home is a place that makes us a break, doesn't it? Home is a place where it determines upon what we're going to be and which path we're going to take. What we become comfortable with can shape our lives. I've seen it time and time again. I've seen people who's had a devastating past. They were raised in homes that they don't even talk about. They were raised in situations and circumstances and environments, and I've seen that oftentimes they respond one or two ways, and there's usually extremes in those one or two ways. The first thing is that they will reject that environment altogether, and they'll go the complete opposite direction. Or they will turn around and they'll duplicate that lifestyle. They'll duplicate that until people that are in abusive situations. People are then homes with drunkenness was involved. With people in home and these things, what they get comfortable with, those that are comfortable with it will duplicate it. Those that are not comfortable with it will reject it. But it's the same thing with a good home. If we get comfortable with the ways of God, if we get comfortable with understanding things of God, if we get comfortable in living a life that is truly surrendered, I truly believe that's where God begins to shape us and begins to mold us. Notice a few things about Hadassah's home life that shaped her life and shaped her future. If I can get it doesn't want to recognize my finger.
Oh,
It's
he'll
not.
take care of it.
Okay.
James is going over.
All right, James, come on. But the first thing that we need to look at is that she was at home with difficulty. She was at home with difficulty. Hadassah was not a stranger to hardship. Hadassah was not a stranger with hurt. Hadassah was not a stranger with degrading situations and circumstances. Hadassah's home was truly one that we need to notice. Well, let's take a look at it and see, okay? And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Here was Esther, who had lost both parents. Psychologists would tell you that she's marked forever. That she would never be truly right, having so much loss at a young age in her life. But one thing that Hadassah realized: we do not go through hardship for hardship to crush us. We go through hardship for hardship to shape us. We can either become bitter in the situation, or we can become better in the situation. And it usually comes down to what we surrender to. Are we surrendering to God being in charge and being in control? Are we surrendering and saying, I give up, I quit, I'm not even going to keep trying? Hadassah was faced with that kind of decision and that kind of way. She made the right choice. She loved her cousin Mordecai. He was a dad for her. She grew in a healthy environment. Why? Because she was at home with difficulty in her life. She didn't let her losses crush her. She let her losses build her in her life. Not only did she not have a father and mother, she was Jewish, which simply meant that she probably lived on the wrong side of the tracks. Along some very poor individuals who had came there, who were second generation from the slaves that had been brought to Babylon, and that she was raised in situations and circumstances where she didn't have nice things. More than likely because she was living in the enclave of the Jewish people and with her Jewish friends and her Jewish neighbors until they come around knocking on the doors looking for young ladies that would pass the muster. We need to realize that she was Jewish, and in Babylon that wasn't a really popular thing to be. Al, were you saying something?
I was going to say, apparently she didn't have any brothers or other sisters.
That's right, that's right.
The scriptures don't say that, but...
She had a very limited family.
Yeah.
And that's a good point, because she was stripped away from the entirety of her family connection. There was no more family connection when she was brought into the palace. There was no more. There's no one else that she could trust or she could rely on. That was a difficulty in her life. Some people would have crushed under that weight, but she allowed it to shape her and to mold her and to make her to be what God would have her to be. Craig, did you have something?
Just thinking that we need to understand all the things Mordecai taught her. Obviously her parents died at a young age, it appears.
Mm-hmm.
So Mordecai was raising her up in her Jewish traditions, right. and with the other Jews that were around them. It goes to show us God's faithfulness. If they never gave up on him, so he never gave up on them.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So she learned to be compliant and simple. She lived a very humble life.
That's right. That's
growing up, which kind of makes going into the palace it had to be a completely...
Culture shock.
Yeah, I mean, she went from being the very bottom of the social issue,
yes,
as we read in the second chapter, to, in a short period of time, in her case, up to the very top. I mean, she found favor with the head eunuch very quickly. He gave her 7 handmaidens of her own. We can kind of figure from the text that not everybody, I mean, he had a determination to make early in the process for the ones that were going to see the king, So he elevated her right away. And it was because she was easy to get along with, did what she was told to do, and yet at the same time was covert, as we talked earlier, not letting anybody know that she was a Jew.
That's right. Good point out.
Also in here, the things that were offered to her, she accepted and didn't ask for anything extra. She took what was
That's right.
given
That's
to
right.
her.
And I believe that's reflective. We're going to see in a second. It's going to be reflective of something God had provided her with as well, spiritually. That I believe is evident in this.
And what comes to mind, we saw the same situation with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Oh yes, absolutely.
They didn't take all the fancy food, just give us fruits and vegetables when they were to get ready for their time in front of the king.
Now, and you got to realize with Esther, even more so than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, she was completely and totally immersed in a completely different world. She didn't walk the streets anymore. She didn't see friends anymore. She didn't see family anymore. For possibly even almost 5 years, she was in the palace. Her meals were brought to her, fed her. The only friends and associates that she had was the other girls in this enclave, I guess you could say, and the leaders that was in this place. So that shows you just how powerfully immersive her entire situation was. So she was at home. She was at home with her difficulties. Now, A.W. Tozer said this, and I think it's powerful. He said, the reason why many are still troubled, still seeking, still making little forward progress, is because they haven't yet come to the end of themselves. We're still trying to give orders and interfering with God's work within us. What a description of Esther. I believe when she went into that palace, she came to the end of herself. She was no longer in charge. She was no longer in control. She couldn't choose the husband that she married. She couldn't choose what she had to wear. She couldn't choose where she slept at night. She was basically a prisoner in the palace. But God had shaped her through the difficulties to be able to stand in the middle of this trial and this situation. I've said it again, I truly believe it with all my heart. As believers, we are designed for difficulty. God has given us the equipment. God has shaped us. God has molded us. The things that have occurred in our past didn't crush us. They strengthened us. They didn't make us bitter. They made us better. So we can see that in her, that one of the first things that she became at home with was she became at home with difficulty. So when difficulty come her way, boom. She was able to easily deal with it. That's why I think that's one reason why God shapes us so often through difficulty. Al, was you?
Let's say her lifestyle before she was chosen to go to the palace was really never having anything at all.
It was very basic.
Yeah,
that's right.
So once you live that type of a life, you get used to it.
Absolutely. She was not demanding. She was one of the big keys that we're going to see here is that she seemed very content with a very simple lifestyle, very content with staying with her cousin and living and him being her father. She was very content with that, which kind of leads us to our very next point, is that she was at home with herself. She was at home with herself. What do you mean? Many of us realize that beauty is more than just a good jawline, is more than just the balance of the features, is more than just having the perfect dimensions. Beauty is as much how you carry yourself as it is what you look like. And I believe that in these years, God would use her. She would be, and because she was surrendered, because she was submitted, she was willing and able to follow the instructions of those that were around about her. And she was able to learn the ways of the palace. She was able to quickly facilitate the ways of the palace. But one thing I realized here is that what people saw in Hadassah or in Esther was not what they thought they were seeing. They saw in her what they thought was confidence, but what it really was humility. What do you mean by that? Humility is not belittling ourselves. Humility is seeing ourselves in light of seeing God. Seeing ourselves in the way that God sees us and love, and living in the confidence of who we are in Him. She wasn't confident in her abilities. She was confident in her God. She wasn't confident in her talents. She was confident in her God. That confidence, I believe, was exuded in every area of her life. How she walked, how she talked, how she carried herself. She had truly placed her life in God's hands. And because of that, she seemed so comfortable with herself. Why? Because she wasn't out to prove anything to anybody. Because she was loved by God. She wasn't out to prove how much better she was, because she knew she wasn't better than anybody else, but she knew that she was a child of God, and that exuded a confidence in her life. I mean, it wasn't pride, it wasn't arrogance, it wasn't belittling herself. You see, she was at peace with herself because of what God had done in her life. She was all right with not having, and she was all right with having. She was all right with being on the poor side of town, and she was all right sitting in the palace. None of those things really made a difference to her, because her confidence wasn't in any of those things. She wasn't proudly poor, and she wasn't proudly rich. She was just confident that she was a child of God, and that God had her in her hand. She was at home with herself. You ever meet anybody that was at home with themselves? You know, they weren't out to prove anything to anybody. They were just comfortable with themselves, and it exuded in everything in her life. She was also at home with her world. Now, I didn't say at home in the world. There's a difference. She was at home with her world. In other words, she had grown comfortable with her place, her station, and her time that God had her in. She was comfortable, like I said, when she was on the wrong side of the tracks, and she was comfortable when she was on the right side of the tracks. Why? Because she trusted that God had placed her where she was supposed to be, when she was supposed to be. Do you know that you were born when you were supposed to be born? That your mission is tied to this time, to everything that's going on around you. Your mission is tied to it. Your place, your purpose, all those things can be tied to God. She was comfortable living in a city full of Persians. Why? Because I believe she knew God had placed her there. And that she knew that God had placed her there at that time. But I want you to notice something that the word says about her in verse number 8. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken from the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian. To the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. She was taken. She didn't volunteer. She didn't promote herself. I believe there were women standing on the street saying, hey, you looking for a beautiful girl? I'll qualify. Yeah, there's a lot of women that would have loved to be the queen. They would love to be, but she wasn't self-promoting. Have you noticed throughout the Word of God that's a pattern? God rarely picks the self-promoting. God rarely picks those that wants to push themselves forward. God always seems to pick those who are truly surrendered to Him. Surrendered to what His plan was, when His plan was, where His plan was. She was at home with her world. You see, and because of that, she realized that she was where she was supposed to be. I believe that Hadassah's ministry started long before chapter 2. Because I thought about this. Later, Hadassah would call for people to fast with her. And they did. Not because the queen had asked it, but because Hadassah had asked it. Now, so there's not a lot of people that'll push away a plate for you. There's not a lot of people that'll go on a day-long fast for you. But because of who she was, because of the ministry that she had already poured into people's lives, she didn't see you as rich or poor. She didn't see you as beneath her. I believe one thing that struck you right away is when you walked into the room with Queen Esther, the first thing was you were probably stunned by her beauty, especially after the Persian women had fixed her up and made her up, but you probably weren't in the room 5 minutes before you realized how real and how caring and how good a woman she really was. She didn't look down on you. You see, God had begun to work in her early. She constantly surrounded herself with people. She constantly surrounded herself with that people she could trust, people she could rely on. She loved, and from the very get-go, God had blessed her and surrounded her with people. Hadassah would realize something we need to realize today. Ministry is not about buildings. It's not about denominations. It's not even about doctrines and creeds. It's about people. God has a message for people. God has deliverance and salvation for people. God has healing for people. God has all these things that He wishes to. Ministry, if it's going to be effective ministry, the kind of ministry that Hadassah knew before she became Esther and continued in her life, is that she was at home with other people. She never thought less of you because she was the queen. God had used her and blessed her. But then, this is the way God set it up. This is what God was doing all those years leading up to her selection and for the 4 years that she was on. But here's another thing that we need to ask ourselves. When destiny knocks, will we recognize it as God? Will we recognize that God is the one that is knocking on that door? That God is the one that's providing for us. At the very moment when that door swings open, when that door swings wide, we will recognize that it has the door that God is opening. Esther demonstrates in her life and in this story, she demonstrates some ways that we can crystal clear know that it's God that's opening those doors. If you've ever been in a situation where God redirects your life, where God moves you from one place to the next, where God changes your situation and circumstances, and you know without a shadow of doubt that it's God, you'll see these signs at work. See, first of all, William Booth. Anybody ever hear of William Booth? William Booth, he founded the Salvation Army. Him and his wife founded the Salvation Army. And before they began to ring bells, they would play a band, and then they'd preach the gospel of Jesus Christ on the streets of the city. And because of it, he had a phenomenal evangelistic record. Him and his wife was leading towns to Jesus. People that down in history who become great men and women of God that was saved on the streets by the Salvation Army. And that William Booth said this: the greatness of man's power is the measure of his surrender. How high you go in the kingdom of God depends on how low you're willing to bow. How much you're willing to place into the hands of a living God. How much you're willing to give up and give in to all that God desires for you. So when we do that, Derrick, and when we surrender to Him, how can we tell when it's God that's swinging wide some doors for us? The very first thing that we'll notice is that there'll be opportunities that only He can provide. Have you ever said that? That had to be God. You know, that would have never happened if it wasn't God. That would